This is Cova da Moura, a district of Lisbon populated mainly by African immigrants. After 5 centuries of colonialism, Portugal has a long historical relationship with Africa. Officially, 6,000 people live here, most of them with origins in ex-Portuguese colonies like Angola, Mozambique and Cape Verde.
Most came in the post-colonial period. Some came before, like my mother, in 1970-1971. There were already some houses in this area then. It was a time when Portugal needed manpower under the Salazar regime. People could build their own houses, and that's how the district came about. And that attracted others. There's a bit more land free so people could call their families and tell them, and their families would come as well.
Anabela Rodriguez is the head of the Youth Mill, a cultural association set up 20 years ago in the district's old mill. Its workers earned it a prize for human rights from the Portuguese Parliament. For Anabela and her colleague Carlos Simaus, immigrants have not been well integrated here.
In Portugal's case, there is still a lot of stigma. And in practice, prejudice and discrimination are much more common than you'd think, because it's a country that in reality discriminates.
In what way?
When I was 18 and going to university, I wanted to rent an apartment. I found an owner and went to see one. When she saw me, she looked surprised, like she didn't expect me to be black. She said, "Can I help you?" And I told her I'd come to see the flat. "I'm afraid it's already been taken." And I was like, "What do you mean? You asked me to come and visit you, and you didn't call me afterwards to tell me it was taken." And she just said, "Well, on the phone, it just didn't sound like, you know." And I was like what?
Anabela was born in Portugal and has no African accent. She's a second-generation immigrant. Even today, or rather especially today, immigration is the most visible aspect of relations between Europe and Africa. Manuel João Ramos, an analyst and coordinator at the Central Library of African Studies, explains.
We must understand that immigration is a reality, but today it's not just immigration based only on colonial ties. For example, it's not just people from Francophone African countries who go to France. Today's migratory reality is completely different. It's migration linked largely to desertification and to the inability to answer serious demographic and environmental problems.
In Lisbon, members of the European and Pan-African parliaments came up with a joint declaration calling for a greater role in evaluating and observing programmes linked to Africa. Parliamentary dialogue promises to continue, just as the issue of migration does.
There are analysts who predict an exponential growth until 2050 and 2100 due to the number of so-called ecological refugees. There are even analysts who say that the Darfur crisis is the first climate change war. Immigration is a natural phenomenon. Migrants will come from overpopulated areas. They'll be young and poor, we're rich but old. If we want to maintain our quality of life and have people who work and support us, we won't be able to count purely on our grandchildren, but also on the immigrants coming in too.
Immigrants like LBC, who was born in Cape Verde and now lives in Portugal. He's noticed a huge imbalance of wealth in the two continents.
If we look at it, there's too much wealth in Europe. I'm not just talking about Portugal, even if there are rich people in Portugal. But across all of Europe, there are children being treated because they're too fat. In Africa, children are undernourished. They have no food, they have nothing.
Economic issues are often a source of discord between the continents. The EU has proposed economic partnership agreements that would lead to a free exchange between the blocs. They're accompanied by a financial package to help African development. 13 countries have signed up, but most, like for example Senegal, are reluctant.
It's not excise duties that are going to develop countries. We've also signed agreements with the United States. Take Senegal. The agreement is signed, nothing gets exported. It's not that that helps a country export. It's not that which helps it develop. It's creating an internal capacity, creating an internal market, training, improving infrastructure. It's making sure there is internal governance in our countries so that people are development orientated.
Development is increasingly aided by loans from Asia, and in particular China. Some in Europe see this as a threat, but the European Commissioner for Development believes it could bring benefits.
I don't see why we would contest Africa's right to have others compete for its markets. In fact, those are the rules. This is a global system. It's not just for the benefit of Europeans, it's also for the benefit of Africans. I even think this competition is healthy. It'll mean Europe will have to change the nature of its relationship and realize Africa is not its own private game reserve. I find that good for Europe and for Africa.
Asian presence in Africa was evident in the summit's press room. A Japanese journalist acknowledges Asia's challenge to Europe.
I think the competition is not focused on the, for example, high technology equipment or like that. The competition will be focused on the especially the energy or rare metals, I think.
The summit turned a page in EU-African relations, both economically and politically. That's the view of Antonio Mateus, a specialist in African relations who's lived there for the last 16 years.
This donor-receiver dependence must end. Here in Lisbon, Africa has shown in its political discourse that the days of holding the colonizers responsible are over. It's 5 decades since European countries started leaving Africa. It's time for Africa to assume its own responsibility.
Responsibility includes improving respect of human rights, which Mateus says is not only an African concern.
European and Western countries have had the time to digest their past and their own atrocities, like we saw in the ex-Yugoslavia. We don't really have the moral high ground to allow us to demand that Africa suddenly becomes, after 5 decades of independence, an example of democracy and human rights.
If the goal is to create harmony between the continents, the challenge is to bring them in step with each other.